Good morning, generals, and welcome to a new episode of Unsung Heroes. Our story starts in February 1945, Anzio, Italy. A German sentry stands guard in the freezing darkness. 200 meters away, a telephone line has gone dead. Critical communications severed. The Wehrmacht needs that line operational, now. The sentry watches the field. Nothing moves. Hours pass. What he doesn't know: there's a man lying in the open ground, motionless, for 3 days. When dawn breaks, the sentry sees something. A farmer, an Italian peasant, struggling with farming equipment near the telephone pole. The German barely glances at him. Just another local, harmless. The farmer works slowly, clumsily. He fiddles with the equipment. He walks away. That night, German intelligence reports are intercepted. The Allies know everything. Troop movements, supply routes, defensive positions. That farmer wasn't Italian. He was Sergeant Tommy Prince, a Salto Ojibwe from Manitoba, Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldier, a man who would earn 9 medals across 2 wars, then die homeless, forgotten, and broken by the country he bled for. This is the story of a warrior who mastered the art of becoming invisible, only to discover that his greatest enemy wasn't the Germans or the North Koreans. It was coming home. Thomas George Prince was born into a world designed to erase him. October 1915, Petersfield, Manitoba. A broken-head Ojibwe reserve where the Canadian government's explicit policy was cultural genocide, residential schools, forced assimilation. The Indian Act stripped Indigenous people of basic rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't leave reserves without permission, couldn't hire lawyers to fight for their land. Tommy's childhood was subsistence hunting and trapping. By age 12, he could track animals through conditions that would blind white trappers. He understood something fundamental. Survival meant seeing what others missed, reading signs, becoming part of the landscape. He learned to disappear. But here's the cruel irony. The same government that tried to destroy his culture would later weaponize his traditional skills. The Canadian military wanted Indigenous scouts, not out of respect, but because they needed men who could do what white soldiers couldn't. Tommy enlisted in June 1940, not to fight for Canada, to prove Canada wrong. The military didn't know what to do with him at first. Prince was assigned to the Canadian Engineers, standard infantry training. He was good. Better than good. He qualified as a paratrooper. But the Army saw him as just another body, another Indigenous soldier who'd do grunt work and be forgotten. Then someone noticed his marksmanship scores. Not just good, perfect. In 1942, the Americans and Canadians formed a joint unit, the 1st Special Service Force. You know them by their nickname, the Devil's Brigade. 3,200 men trained in mountain warfare, amphibious assault, demolition, and reconnaissance. They were brutal, elite, and utterly without mercy. The Germans would later call them the Black Devils because they fought at night, wore blackened faces, and left death cards on enemy corpses. Tommy Prince became their best scout, not one of the best. His commanding officer, Colonel Robert Frederick, would later write, "He was the best natural soldier I ever met." December 1943, Monte la Difensa, Italy. The Germans hold the mountaintop. The position is considered impregnable. Sheer cliffs, machine gun nests, artillery zeroed on every approach. The Allies have thrown multiple assaults at it. Everyone has been slaughtered. The Devil's Brigade gets the job. Tommy Prince volunteers for reconnaissance. He'll scout the German positions alone, at night, through terrain that experienced mountaineers had called impossible. He goes up in darkness. For 6 hours, he moves through German lines, not around them, through them. He maps every machine gun position, every mortar pit, every sentry route. He's so close to German soldiers that he can hear them talking, complaining about the cold, about missing home. He memorizes everything. When he returns, his intelligence is so detailed, so precise, that the officers initially don't believe him. No one could get that close and survive. The assault succeeds. The Devil's Brigade takes the mountain. The cost is heavy. 90% casualties in some companies. But they succeed because Tommy Prince gave them a map written in German blood. His reward? A promotion and the military medal for bravery. The military's recognition of Tommy's brilliance created a problem. He was too valuable to waste. They needed him for the impossible missions, the ones where survival seemed unlikely. Which brings us back to Anzio, January 1944. The Allies are stuck. The beachhead is surrounded. The Germans have the high ground, and their communications are too good. They're intercepting Allied movements, repositioning forces, crushing every breakthrough attempt. Someone needs to cut their observation capabilities. Tommy volunteers. The plan is insane. Infiltrate 1,500 meters behind enemy lines, locate a German field telephone junction, tap into it, and relay intelligence back to Allied forces. The life expectancy for this mission? Hours, maybe. Tommy goes in at night, finds the junction box, installs the wiretap. Then he realizes the wire runs to an exposed position. If he tries to hide nearby, German patrols will find him. If he leaves, they'll discover the tap and remove it. So he doesn't hide. He finds an abandoned farmhouse, takes off his uniform, puts on civilian clothes he'd carried in his pack. He finds farming tools, and for the next 3 days, he becomes an Italian farmer. He works the field, in full view of German sentries, while lying on the phone line. When the line breaks, because he's lying on it, he gets up, walks over to it like a confused peasant trying to fix his farm equipment. He pretends to struggle with it, while actually splicing it back together and checking the tap. The Germans watch him the entire time. They see an incompetent farmer, a local who's too stupid to realize he's in a combat zone. For 3 days, Tommy relays German intelligence, troop movements, artillery coordinates, supply routes. The Germans never suspected. When he finally extracts, his commander recommends him for the Silver Star, one of America's highest military honors. The citation reads, "His courage and dedication to duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service." Tommy Prince fought through Italy, through southern France. He was wounded, he recovered, he went back. By the time the war ended, he'd earned the military medal, the Silver Star, multiple campaign medals. He was the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history. He came home to a country that wouldn't let him vote. Think about that. A man who'd killed enemy soldiers to defend democracy couldn't participate in that democracy. The Indian Act still stripped him of basic citizenship rights. He returned to the Broken Head Reserve, tried to find work. Employers saw his medals, heard his stories, then looked at his skin and said no. The Canadian government offered veterans generous benefits, land grants, business loans, educational assistance, unless you were Indigenous. The Veterans Land Act explicitly discriminated against First Nations veterans. Tommy couldn't access the same benefits as the white soldiers he'd fought beside. His applications were denied, delayed, lost in bureaucracy. He watched white veterans build lives, homes, businesses. He couldn't get a steady job. 1950, Korea. Tommy was 34, too old for combat, but when the Korean War started, he re-enlisted immediately. Not for patriotism, not for glory, for a paycheck, for purpose, for the only place where his skills mattered more than his race. He joined the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, served as a reconnaissance specialist, and once again, he was exceptional. He earned the Korean Service Medal and United Nations Service Medal. But Korea was different. The combat was more brutal, the conditions worse, and Tommy was older, carrying wounds from the first war that had never properly healed. He developed arthritis in his feet, from those days lying motionless in the Italian cold, pretending to be a farmer while German boots walked past his head. He came home in 1952. The discrimination was worse. The 1950s and 60s were a slow-motion collapse. Tommy drank. He tried to work. He couldn't hold jobs, not because he was incompetent, but because employers didn't want an Indigenous veteran, no matter how decorated. He married. He had 5 children. His wife left him. His drinking got worse. The Canadian government, the same government that had used his skills, that had decorated him, that had sent him to die twice, offered him nothing. No mental health support, no job training, no acknowledgement that they'd broken a functional human being and handed back shattered pieces. By the late 60s, Tommy Prince was homeless. The man who'd outsmarted German intelligence lived in Winnipeg's worst neighborhoods. He slept in alleys. He begged for change. Veterans organizations tried to help. They got him into public housing, but the trauma was too deep, the alcoholism too advanced. In 1977, Tommy Prince died of a heart attack in a Winnipeg rooming house. He was 62 years old. Here's what makes Tommy Prince's story different from the Nazi officials this channel usually covers. Tommy wasn't a war criminal. He wasn't incompetent. He wasn't delusional. He was used. The Third Reich's inner circle destroyed themselves through ambition, paranoia, and moral bankruptcy. Their collapse was self-inflicted. Tommy's destruction was inflicted by the society he defended. The Canadian government actively discriminated against him. They denied him benefits. They refused him opportunities. They watched him spiral into poverty and did nothing. The same skills that made him invisible to the enemy made him invisible to his own country. But here's the cruelest part. Tommy knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't delusional. He understood that Canada valued him as a weapon, but despised him as a citizen, and he kept fighting anyway. Not because he believed things would change, but because fighting was the only thing that gave his life meaning. Let's examine the specific trauma. Complex PTSD manifests differently in everyone. For Tommy, it was the dissonance between two identities. Identity 1, elite warrior, respected, valued, given impossible missions because commanders trusted him completely. Identity 2, Indigenous man in mid-20th century Canada, denied voting rights, discriminated against, invisible unless useful. The military didn't solve his trauma, it created it. They taught him that his worth was conditional, that he mattered only when white men needed someone to bleed for them. When the wars ended, so did his value. The alcoholism wasn't weakness. It was self-medication for a wound that couldn't heal. Because the wound wasn't just psychological, it was societal. It was embedded in laws, in institutions, in the casual racism that prevented him from getting work. He couldn't fight his way out of this one. For years after his death, Tommy Prince was forgotten. Then something shifted. Indigenous rights activists began reclaiming his story. Veterans groups acknowledged the discrimination. The Canadian Forces named a building after him. Manitoba inducted him into their Sports Hall of Fame for his pre-war lacrosse career. In 2008, Canada Post issued a stamp with his image. In 2010, the Canadian government formally apologized for its treatment of Indigenous veterans. 70 years too late. Tommy Prince never lived to see his country acknowledge what they'd done. He died believing he'd been forgotten, but his story exposes something crucial about how nations treat their heroes. The Nazi officials we cover on this channel were architects of evil. They deserved their obscurity, their historical condemnation. Tommy Prince was a hero by any reasonable measure, yet his country treated him as disposable. This isn't unique to Tommy. Across every conflict, marginalized groups have served with distinction, then returned to discrimination. African American soldiers in World War II fought against fascism abroad, then came home to Jim Crow segregation. Navajo code talkers created an unbreakable encryption system, then were denied veterans' benefits for decades. Japanese Canadian soldiers fought for the Allies while their families were imprisoned in internment camps. The pattern is consistent. Nations will exploit marginalized communities during crisis, then abandon them during peace. Tommy Prince's story is a masterclass in institutional betrayal. I want you to imagine Tommy's last days. He's in a Winnipeg rooming house. His body is failing. The arthritis from lying in frozen Italian fields has spread. His liver is destroyed from decades of alcohol. His heart is giving out. Does he think about Anzio? About the German sentry who walked past him while he pretended to fix a telephone line? Does he think about Monte la Difensa? About mapping German positions while enemy soldiers talked about their girlfriends 20 meters away? Or does he think about coming home, about job applications denied, about the look in employers' eyes when they saw his skin. Which betrayal hurt more? The answer is obvious. Enemy soldiers tried to kill him. That was expected. That was war. His own country destroyed him slowly, methodically, through policy. That's the wound that never healed. Most episodes on this channel end with a war criminal facing justice, a Nazi official committing suicide, a general executed for atrocities. This one ends differently. Tommy Prince's story is a mirror. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to serve? What does society owe its warriors? And what happens when nations treat their heroes as disposable? The Wehrmacht officers we profile made choices. They chose evil. They chose power. They chose complicity. Tommy chose to fight for a country that didn't value him. That's not weakness. That's a tragedy of misplaced faith. He believed that service would earn respect, that defending democracy would grant him a place in it. He was wrong, and the country that failed him has still not fully reckoned with that failure. Let me give you the accounting. What Tommy Prince gave Canada: 6 years of military service across 2 wars, 9 medals for valor and service, intelligence that saved hundreds of Allied lives, innovation in reconnaissance tactics still taught today. What Canada gave Tommy Prince: discrimination under the Indian Act, denial of veterans' benefits, unemployment and poverty, a lonely death in a rooming house, recognition only after he couldn't see it. The math doesn't balance. It never will. Thanks for watching.